Hello everyone. How's the conference been so far? Last lap. So hopefully I'm not going to try and go through a lot of PowerPoint presentation, but talk about something that I think is very evolving, kind of very interesting because the CI adoption in the mobile space, and I'm curious to hear feedback from all of you in terms of what you're doing, adoption, but so far what I've heard is it is one area where the CI adoption is still pretty anemic. I mean, I have some numbers which paint a picture that they're like 80% of the CI mobile development teams that have still not adopted CI. Only a very few are doing CI, and out of those very few, there are only few groups which are doing a complete pipeline automation in this space. So very, very interesting place to be for all of you who have to deal with it as part of supporting development and release of your mobile application. A little bit about myself. I, along with two of my technical co-founders, Alex and Itzik, we have been in the cloud infrastructure software space for years now. My two technical co-founders were actually the folks who were part of the KVM development team quite some time back. And we have been building, marketing, selling cloud software, virtualization software, the infrastructure software for quite some time. And we, in the last few years, we were working with a very interesting company called Revelo Systems, where we were doing some pretty cool things with nested virtualization on top of public cloud, again targeted for DevOps. And we repeatedly ran into, and the whole CI adoption for mobile was just starting to take off. This was about 3-4 years ago. And we were getting repeated requests, mostly from the Android side of the mobile world, about, we want to adopt CI for mobile Android app development, and we want to do it. However, we need to figure out the infrastructure piece of it. Everything else is there, but what about the infrastructure piece of it? The on-demand dev test environment and the infrastructure that supports our CI pipeline. And we were getting a lot of requests where people were actually coming to us at that time to see if there's something that can be done in the public cloud domain in that area. And in my previous company, we were trying to dabble into that, and we got acquired by Oracle, and things changed and all that for good. However, me and my two partners, we actually took this idea and started working on this particular space, but very specific to iOS. Because when we looked at the iOS app development, things were actually like 10 or even more years behind when you look at the infrastructure. So if you look at, if you look at the adoption of CI and CD in the Linux and the Windows side of things, right, it really took off, and this is nothing new, but it really took off when the infrastructure on which those pipelines could execute all these tests, whether it's performance tests, security tests, functional tests, when that infrastructure became more agile, right, and when it became on demand. And that happened first with virtualization, and then it evolved into cloud, whether public or private cloud, right? And that's really what has significantly helped the adoption of CI, CD for the Linux and Windows. But then if you look at on the other side, which is the development, app development in the Apple ecosystem, there wasn't really a need for any, I guess, innovation in that space, because as we all know, the application area on Mac OS, wasn't really mainstream. Enterprises don't really use Mac, and so nobody really cared about it, right? However, now things are very different. Now the emphasis is on all mobile, right? And there are some staggering numbers about the amount of application development that's taking place in the mobile space. And I'll focus more on the iOS side, because that's what I'm going to share with you today. And some of the numbers I have are pretty crazy. And I don't know how many of you attended the Apple worldwide developer conference that took place a couple of months ago. But there are some very interesting numbers. That there are about 2 million applications in the iOS App Store currently, which is expected to grow to 5 million by 2020. I mean, amazing growth. If you look at watchOS, some of you probably have the Apple Watch, which was launched just last year. So within 1 year, there are 19,000 applications developed for watchOS. I mean, amazing number, just in 1 year. And this is going to grow even bigger because, obviously, things are going to get better as far as support and all that stuff. There's one other very interesting statistics that I was able to get was, and this actually was shared by Tim Cook during the conference, that until June of this year, there were about 140 billion downloads till date of apps from the iOS App Store. I mean, I think it's mind-blowing. I mean, the number of people downloading application. Not just like, I would say that is just 40% or 50% of the mobile space, right? Because the rest is then non-Apple, Android space. However, the flip side of it is, what I was able to gather was, I've heard numbers in the range of like the mobile, 80% of the mobile application development teams actually don't do automated testing, automated continuous integration release cycles. They're not doing. This is still being done for the most part manually, all the discrete steps in the pipeline. Right? In spite of the fact that the pace at which the updates and the new things that are developed on mobile app is significantly higher than in traditional web apps. Apple itself, every week, they get 100,000 inbound. These are like either updates on existing apps or new apps they get for review. So you can imagine, like, how quickly people are submitting changes and doing development on this mobile app, and how shorter the release cycle is, which even makes it even more important to have obviously automated, testing and deployment and release as part of your pipeline, right? So this is kind of, when we started working on and I'll share with you this very interesting infrastructure software, especially targeted in the macOS space. When we started working on it, these are the numbers we were looking at. And we're kind of like, wouldn't it be nice if we could take the similar concepts that have fueled and made application development more agile, more scalable, much higher quality on the Linux and Windows side, and kind of try and bring those concepts over to mobile application development space, especially Apple, which is a significant part of mobile app dev. And we started working on this technology, which is really a built from scratch server grade virtualization technology to build on-demand dev test infrastructure for all sort of application development within the Apple ecosystem. So obviously, this is a software that runs on top of macOS, since all Apple ecosystem development has to take place on macOS. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to pretty much elevate the level of automation that you can do in that space to the same that you're doing for supporting your web app, for example, and hopefully pretty soon Android also. Now that Google is going to expose nested virtualization, so you're going to be able to actually run Android emulators on top of Google KVM Cloud pretty soon. I mean, I think some of you already know about it. And that's really what our focus was. So I found some very funny cartoons that I thought I would share with you, kind of reinforce the idea. So what is this? I mean, some of you might be thinking like, so it is a virtualization platform. Like, so what is so unique about it, and how is it gonna really help with the CI/CD for mobile apps, especially in the iOS side? basically, we have actually built this platform very specific for Mac operating systems. So, it is completely para-virtualized, and for for those of you who kind of know much about virtualization technologies and all, you actually probably, if you look at the way things are being done today, for the teams that are doing some CI on iOS mobile app, they are sort of like hacking together solutions using either tools, desktop virtualization tools for macOS, like there are VirtualBox, a free tool, Fusion, I think, is another one, and a few of those, right? And some of them are actually brave enough to also try and do it with ESXi and build like a macOS cloud using ESXi, right? However, the issue with all of those approaches is that those softwares are not really built for macOS virtualization natively, right? They all go and really go down to the kernel level, and then they install drivers, kernel level drivers, which then actually start impacting a lot of things the way the Mac OS operates, right. So, we have actually, we have sort of looked at those particular areas and tried to address those by building this completely para-virtualized virtualization, which actually uses Apple's newly released framework. It's called Hypervisor Framework, which was released with Yosemite release of the operating system. And what it does is, by doing that, Apple has sort of exposed a interface layer in the user space to enable virtualization on Mac OS, and that's what we are leveraging. Some of the key things which are very, very important for CI in this space is obviously, you want faster boot time, so that when you have multiple jobs running on different Mac hosts and you have virtual instances on those hosts, you actually don't want your jobs to be sitting for the operating system to boot, and then all the dependencies to be installed and all that, right? So, we are actually the virtualization platform that we are building has basically, it's going to present fully instantiated booted virtual instances for that you can use as Jenkins slaves or configure as Jenkins slaves, and I'll show you that as when I show you the demo. You can get that up and running in less than a second when you're doing that. Couple of other key things is IOPS. Again, when you're doing a build in your pipeline, very, very important that IOPS speed, and you get really high performance for that. So, para-virtualized drivers for high IOPS is another key thing we have built. And then the other one is, one of the beauties, right? And all of you probably have a Mac, so most of you have a Mac, and that one of the beauty about working on Mac, and that's the reason some of you like working on Mac, is the way applications operate on the Mac, right? They seem like very native, they seem very lightweight, they seem very non-intrusive to each other, right? And there's a reason for that. That is how Apple allows applications to execute on top of their kernel and on top of their operating system. They want applications to be sandboxed, completely sandboxed, so that if something crashes, it doesn't bring down the entire operating system like it does in some other, the operating systems that are out there. And the same principles, they've taken also to their mobile devices as well, iOS and watchOS. So that was one of the other things we had in mind, was that the virtualization and this cloud software for macOS should feel and behave in the same manner. It should be lightweight. It should feel native to a Mac. It should be like it's a native Mac app that you're running. However, it's a lot more than an app, because it's actually an infrastructure software that you can use to build an on-demand macOS cloud to run your mobile CI, iOS mobile CI on top of that. And so, so we built it, so it has a footprint of 13 MB. That's pretty much it. Pretty amazing for a virtualization software. And so right now, we are in the process of doing testing on this. We've done a couple of customer testing, customer scenario testing, and we're really our goal is that we want to be able to enable an Apple developer to build a dev test environment, on-demand dev test environment on his or her Mac, right, that they can use. So they can have different versions of simulator, iOS simulator running in different OS instances. They could have different versions of Xcode to build against different releases of iOS, and they could all do it on top of their Mac using a virtualization cloud software for Mac OS. And then once they are ready and when they push their code changes or code bits into a central repository, then basically the DevOps team can actually instrument it so that they can do builds and parallel tests on still on the on-premise Mac operating hardware, however, do it on top of a cloud, right? So we're looking at 2 versions. One would be for the developers, developer Mac, and the other will really allow you to build a cloud Mac operating system private cloud that you can use as the infrastructure for continuous integration testing. So that's kind of what it is. So this sort of gives you a high level layout of how it would look. Obviously, there are a lot more pieces to it. But what we have done as a first step is, Jenkins being one of the primary CI tools, we've actually made a Jenkins plugin, and so that it's easy for all the existing DevOps folks to actually just take it in, right? Because you're not going to install a separate Jenkins server just for mobile app development team. You want all it to be integrated as part of your mainstream Jenkins CI that you're building. So we've actually built a plugin, and that's what I'm going to actually show you. This plugin is right now built with the prototype of our virtualization cloud software for Mac OS, but it will give you an idea of if you are in the process of implementing CI for mobile app, then you can start to think about it and kind of start to put the pieces together to do it. So let me actually switch to the demo, and I'm actually going to try and connect to a Jenkins server which we have hosted in Amazon, and a couple of Mac hosts that again are hosted somewhere else. So it's a pretty interesting setup. So a little bit of background. So we have what I'm going to show you kind of gives you describes to you the concept of CI for mobile app, especially for iOS. Obviously it can be expanded in scale in terms of you can expand the dev test cloud by adding more Mac host and adding more capacity, and obviously you can expand the pipeline itself or make it much give it more coverage by, you're going to have a lot more steps in it in terms of the integration with other tools which probably are collecting a lot more data on the pipeline execution and all that stuff. So obviously all those things you're all very familiar with. But really the objective here is to share with you more information about how you could apply the same concept of on-demand infrastructure into mobile app space to support your CI for that. So I'm actually going to log into our Jenkins server here, and I'll describe to you how you will set up what we are calling as a Virtu cloud. This may change later on as we come out with this solution. So nothing new here. All of you folks are obviously much more familiar with this than I am hands-on with. But let me explain to you, the high-level steps, right? So very similar to how you set up the infrastructure, dev test infrastructure when you're doing the same thing for web application development, right? Basically, you actually are going to set up a dev test cloud, right? Now, there are various ways, right? Nowadays, you're probably doing it in the public cloud directly and using the Jenkins plugin for AWS or, or any other public cloud for that matter, or you're using ESXi plugin and all that. So we've sort of tried to do it in the same way. What?
Is that what you wanted to use right now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Like that, right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Yeah. So as part of this plugin, we have actually kind of tried to give you the same options so you can define a Mac OS cloud, and you see it out here. So standard Jenkins configuration options, you define a cloud. In this case, this is a Veertu Mac OS cloud. You define your hosts. Now, the hosts are your, in each individual Mac or Mac Mini, right? What I have seen is for most of the mobile iOS testing, a lot of folks are adopting Mac Mini because it has a small form factor and all of those, they can stack it up if they have to have many to support their release cycle and all that. So irrespective of which hardware you're using, your host is each of those individual Mac machines, right, that you're using. So you will come here, you'll actually define your cloud, and you're going to start to define each of the individual hosts that are going to contribute capacity to that cloud. Once you define each of the hosts, then you actually move on to the next section, which is where you're actually going to define, and this is pretty interesting because what you're defining now are these individual sort of build templates or test templates, right, environment templates that you need to do your continuous integration. So for example, let me explain it a little bit more. Specifically for iOS development, when you're doing builds for iOS, obviously you have to support multiple iOS versions because there's 6, there's 6S, there's 7 now, and in some cases you might have to support even versions previous to that also. And then you have iPad, so you have to support different versions of iPad, iPad Mini. Then you have watchOS, right? So depending upon the spectrum of devices that you have to support your application on, you need to do builds for all of those specific underlying operating systems, right? And in the iOS space, Apple has provided a SDK, which is the Xcode SDK, right? So you're building against different versions of Xcode, Xcode 7.2, Xcode 7.3. Interestingly, the Xcode versions don't match directly with the iOS or watchOS version. So, that's another story where you have to keep a complete matrix of those things, right? But so when you are implementing CI for iOS app dev, then you pretty much have to have a way where, when a code commit happens, you can spawn a build against all of those applicable Xcode versions as an example, right? And then also following that, depending upon the amount of test coverage you do for each of those commits, you can then start those as well, again, based, against different iOS simulator versions, because again, you got to support different devices, device types, or different device models, right? So what this concept of slave templates let you do is actually kind of define what are called as golden images, right? So you can actually define an Xcode 7.2 slave template with all the dependencies, right, that you need for your build. So all the relevant Ruby dependencies, all the relevant Xcode SDK dependencies, Puppet Chef configuration pre-built in, that if you need to do any of that prior to starting the build. So you can define each of these multiple golden templates when you're defining your cloud, and keep them ready, right? And the whole intention of this is, very similar to how you're doing it in the cloud when you're doing this on a cloud for a non-mobile app, right? You have templates, you use the templates to spin instances, and those are the instances on which your CI is going to run the build as well as the test on, right? And in the non-mobile world, you are doing it, mostly this, when you're doing cross-browser testing, right, as part of your CI pipeline, you're sort of doing it in that way. This becomes very complicated very quickly in the mobile world, right, because of the number of devices that are out there and the operating systems for each of the devices that you have to support. And that's why, kind of begs the need of having a more sort of, I don't want to call it device cloud because that has a connotation of physical device cloud, which can never scale. But to really have a cloud, mobile cloud, in which you can, using simulators and emulators, do a lot more testing against different versions, against different device type much earlier in the pipeline. And I know one of the earlier guests actually did talk about it, that the more you can bring simulator, emulator testing earlier in the pipeline, the better it is for your entire CI, right? So basically what you're doing here is defining all these different templates. So in this case, I think I have 2 templates defined, and one is a 7.3 and a 7.2. And really the template is referring to what you see here. So it is really referring to a snapshot, right, which is a virtual, which is residing on your hosts, right, that make up your cloud, right. So this is the snapshot that is managed by the virtualization software that you have already pre-built. So this is, your template is going to use this particular snapshot or image to spin up additional instances that you're going to be running your builds for your mobile app, right. And there are obviously a lot more other parameters, where your Jenkins slave process is going to run, and all of those other things that you have to define. So once you've sort of configured this, and I'm going to come out of this, you're pretty much set. So you have defined a target cloud, macOS cloud, which is going to be the infrastructure against which you will run your builds and test for your iOS mobile app CI, right? Now you've done that. Now the next part is really defining jobs, right? And this is the standard. This is defining any jobs like you would do in Jenkins, depending upon how you want to run these jobs, right? In my case, what I'm going to show you is actually an example. We actually have 2 parent jobs defined, and one is kind of defined to show you a scenario where you actually, how you can actually run multiple tests in parallel against different iOS simulator versions, because that's one of the things you would want to do. And the other job that is defined here, which is this particular job, the parallel build job, kind of demonstrates to you how you can run parallel builds for a single commit against different Xcode versions. So you're going to do that and then push it again, for testing, right? So it kind of describes both of those scenarios, and they are both defined as parent jobs. So you've got like 2 jobs corresponding to each one of them that are running. So let me actually start one of these, and then I'll switch the screen here so I can actually show you what is happening on the infrastructure side, which is virtualized as your pipeline starts to run, and how the instances are getting spun up and all that fun stuff. So let me start with the parallel test job, and before let me actually show you the configuration of this, because I think there are some interesting parts in that. Go back here. So this is obviously a job that's defined to run multiple tests in parallel. And what is really, one thing in particular I want to point out is you can see that there are 2 jobs defined under this sort of parent job, right? iOS build with test 1 and test 2. And if you look at the test 1 job, so this is where you're kind of defining and saying that, okay, you know, for these set of tests, these tests need to run on this particular iOS simulator version, right? So I've got a iOS simulator version 6, which, you know, probably only runs with Xcode X2, right? Because that's another challenge, that iOS simulator version itself are only supported against specific versions of Xcode. So you need to, you know, when you're building your golden image, you need to kind of, you know, build all that together. And that's, you know, that's really what, you know, that's the extent of complexity that you're sort of automating and packaging when you are trying, you know, when you build this, this template or capsule. Because if you are not using a software which can sort of, you know, help you build this on-demand infrastructure, then you may actually do the entire instrumentation of your CI pipeline, but then what you're going to be doing is actually pushing the builds and test on physical machines, right? And this is how it's done today, right? You're actually doing all this, and you have physical machines dedicated for a specific build. So, because I've talked to, you know, I've talked to like large iOS app publishers, like, and I'm talking about like the #1 and #2 app publishers, you know which ones. And I am just amazed to hear the number of Mac minis they use for build and test. And, you know, all the sharding they have to do for the capacity, to take care of the capacity issues and all, because these are publishers who have, you know, their iOS development team, developers are like in thousands, right? So imagine 1,000 developers committing code X number of times a day, spinning up builds that need to be tested against multiple Xcode versions, built against multiple Xcode versions, and then again tested against multiple iOS simulator versions. I mean, it's a nightmare to manage a build and test infrastructure that is, you know, all physical. I mean, you would have to like be very creative, and this is what they've done. I mean, they have done it. They're using all sorts of scripts and all. So really, by sort of bringing this whole concept of, you know, on-demand infrastructure, where you can create golden images, snapshots, templates, spin them up, and propagate the changes evenly for everyone is it's nothing new, it's nothing novel, but it sort of brings that whole concept from the traditional Linux, you know, non-mobile world to the mobile world, which I think is where it's needed even more, because, you know, those applications are updated much more frequently. So you can see here, this is an you know, this kind of demonstrate. This is, you're sort of associating a specific template. So this is your slave Xcode 7.3 template that's associated with a particular set of tests, right, that this job is going to run. Whereas this particular job, which is the iOS build with test 2 job, has a different slave template associated with it, because it is probably going to run a different set of tests with iOS simulator version 6.3 as an example, right? So you're going to have different set of tests because you have to test against different simulator version. So you can obviously, you know, make that mapping, and it's very common to make that mapping using node label and all with Jenkins, right? So you're going to use the same concept, nothing different when you're defining all of those things. So once you define all that, you're pretty much configured your job to run against this on-demand infrastructure, right? So let's go ahead and start this, and then I'll kind of show you what's happening in the background. So I'm going to start the build, and in the meantime, I will actually log into the Mac host itself, which is part of the iOS DevTest Cloud, right, that you configured earlier, and describe to you what's happening out there. So let's, I'm going to, we actually are using, just for this demo, I'm actually using some Mac machines from Mac Stadium, which I believe they are one of the sponsors here. They provide Mac, physical Macs sort of, as a service. So we use them for our own testing purposes. So I'm actually connecting to one of those Mac hosts. So you can kind of see here, this is the Mac host, right? And what you're seeing here are these different slaves that are getting spun up, right? So this is the X3 slave that you can see it spinning up, and you'll see once it's there, you'll actually see it listed in the in one of the dashboards here. And if I go back, let's go back to where's my browser? Yeah, let's go back to the Jenkins dashboard so you can kind of see the iOS, one of the jobs is starting, and then after a few minutes, the other job. So when this job is starting, it actually spins up the correct associated build machine, right? Which is what you're seeing here. That I showed you earlier. So let's see if I could go back. Projector doesn't make things easier. Okay, so this is one of the build machines, and then when the other jobs start, you're going to see the other build machines come up, right? So you are spinning up these instances on demand. You are, they are already pre-configured with all the Ruby dependencies, the relevant Xcode dependencies. You're going to set up as part of the process after the build, right? You're going to you need to sign all iOS apps, right? So you can even configure those appropriate certificate and keychains for each of the virtual instances or the templates, so that when your build is complete, they are signed with the right certificate, developer certificate authority or the organization authority, and then you're ready to push it further into the pipeline for testing purposes. So this is an example of how you're going to be able to do that, right? And then you'll see that it'll actually bring up the simulator and then kill itself, right? Once the job is done, then it's actually going to kill itself. And if I go back to this screen, you'll see the other one also come up. And then the other scenario is testing, right? So testing, again, same concept, configure your slave templates with the appropriate iOS simulator versions. Bring up as many of these as you want to on your Mac OS host cloud that you have configured. Obviously, as per the licensing, you're going to be bringing up two virtual instances per Mac OS that Apple allows you to do that. If you have an enterprise agreement with them, you can probably bring up even more and configure it that way, and then set up the entire infrastructure in that manner. So this, obviously, this software, we are not ready to ship it yet. We are in the final stages of opening up our private beta program for this. So I'm happy to have a conversation with one of you who wants to talk more about it. We'll be happy to share a beta with you so you can kind of start to play with it, and would love to get feedback. I'll also share a private beta sign-up site that we're going to open up pretty soon, that you can opt in, and we're looking at releasing the beta for this sometime end of October, and we'll be sharing additional information. All right. Thank you.